All right. Kevin back with you for another episode of the $1,000,000 Relationships Podcast. And today I am here with Bill Flynn. Bill, welcome. So awesome to have you today on the show.
Kevin, great to be here. Looking forward to it.
And I want to start by giving a shout out to the folks over at the podcastguest.com platform. That's where you and I met. Those guys, man, they are doing an incredible work in this world. And I have met a number of really awesome podcast guests as a result of the work that they're doing. And so I just want to, honor that and honor the work that those guys are doing because, Bill, without them, I don't know that you and I would have even met, but I'm glad we did. And it's also was cool to find out, and I know we kind of were talking before we hit the record button, that we got a couple mutual friends in common, which is kind of cool too and stuff. And I know as soon as I saw that, I'm like, man, that just sold me on having a conversation with Bill because we had this mutual friend in common and stuff. And you know what? Heck, I'll say who it is, Mitch Russo. I mean, Mitch and I go back a long ways, and I know you guys do too. And you've been on Mitch's podcast and stuff. And I know Mitch did a lot of work with Tony Robbins back in the day. And yep. Mitch is just a great guy too. And it's interesting when you have those connections. Even though Bill, you and I, we are here talking for the very first time ever, but it just feels so at ease because we have these mutual friends and stuff. And so welcome. And I'm looking forward to just having this conversation with you today. And what I'd like to do is I just want to turn over to you to start with so we can have you share. We can set a little bit of context for the conversation. And you can talk about what you do, who you serve, what inspires you most about the work that you do through your business, and also give us a little bit of context on the backstory, how you got into doing what you do as well.
Sure. Yeah, so I have had two sort of arcs, if you will, to what I do.
Okay.
I started off in the late 80s, early 90s, doing startups in the Boston area, and I did 10 of them over about 25 years, give or take.
Wow.
All in high tech, all different types of things, speech recognition, e-commerce, affiliate marketing, a whole bunch of different types of things over the years. And in the middle of doing all that, I got an experience that really led me to what I'm doing now.
Okay.
And that was, I basically was a coach. I turned into a coach. I had a situation where I took over a division of a company, and we ran into a little bit of trouble on my first official day as being the head of this division, and we had to fix a whole bunch of stuff and sort of restart the business, if you will. That's probably an overstatement, but it was certainly a jarring situation. And I had to say, look, we have to get from where we are today to where we want to be. Here's what I think it looks like. Let's discuss, debate, and decide on that. And then I need, each of you to draw your map from where we are here to what you need to get there on your side, and we're going to help each other through that. And letting them know I don't know how to do most of the things that we need to do. So I'm just going to help you through that, and we're going to help each other through that. And that worked really well. And I sort of tucked that away. I did 4 more startups after that.
Okay.
None of them went very well. The first 6 were great. I was basically 5 for 6. I should have stopped while I was ahead.
Good for you on that.
yeah, that's a pretty rare number.
Yeah.
And 2 IPOs and 7 acquisitions over that time, but I tucked that away, and I said, I'd like to figure out how to do that again. And then I got a chance. In 2015, the company that I was with, we both basically separated. It wasn't a good fit for either of us.
Okay.
And I was like, what do I want to do next? Do I want to do an 11th startup, or do I want to, find something else? And I sort of harkened back to, years earlier. And I said, I want to try to figure out how to do that. And I know we talk about relationships, and that was sort of the first relationship that I would talk about. I reached out to someone. I can save that story for later. And now I'm a coach. I'm a business growth coach.
Okay.
And I teach CEOs or leadership or leaders of companies, heads of companies, and their leadership team a particular growth framework that is mostly based on scaling up which some people might know. It's been around for about 30, 35 years. And then I've got some other things that I add to it. It's really not mine, other than the fact that I've taken a few things and put them together. But none of the things that I do are really original thoughts. It was just sort of the compilation kind of stuff that I do. And that's sort of how we get into today. I've been doing that for about 8 years, give or take now, something like that. I love doing it. I know what a calling is. It's something you do for free, and it gives you energy when you do it. Time flies when you're doing it, and I do all those things. So it's a wonderful situation to be in right now.
Wow, very cool, very cool. I know that feeling of just really figuring. Dan Sullivan of Strategic Coach. I know we were talking about Dan and Joe before we hit the record button too, and one of the things he talks about and teaches is unique ability. This God-given gift or talents that we are just very good at, just naturally, that like seems so easy for us, but
Yeah.
yet a lot of times we just kind of like, brush it off like, anybody could do that, but not true. We
Right.
have, and every one of us has this, that so many people don't really discover that. And
Right.
it sounds from what you've shared, you have definitely discovered that and how to turn that into a business that lets you provide immense value in the world and also get compensated well for your efforts, for your role in that too and stuff.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
so good for you. Good for you. Okay. So now that we've got a little bit of context set, I'm going to reiterate the question for the benefit of the listeners. So, Bill, have you ever been introduced to a person or persons who completely changed the course of your life or your business, so much so that much of what you have today would not be possible if not for this person or persons? And Bill, I'm just really excited to hear your story, your experience around this topic of relationships.
Yeah, sure. Well, I wasn't introduced to this person. I did the reaching out
Okay.
for them. And it was, as I mentioned earlier, around 2015, end of 2015, early 2016, I was sort of figuring out what I want to do next. And I sort of like this idea of helping people have the same experience that I did, in sort of building a system, but also having the impact on the other folks on the team. And I wanted to be able to do that in another way. And it wasn't necessarily being a leader again. It was, I wanted to sort of share it with more and more people than that. So I looked into coaching. I looked at, actually, it's funny. I looked at Strategic Coach. I looked at Action Coach. I looked at EOS and Scaling Up and Value Builder and a whole bunch of others. And I decided that, as you said, sort of what really resonated with me was the stuff in Scaling Up. And Scaling Up is used to be called Mastering the Rockefeller Habits about 20, 25 years ago. It was a book written by Vern Harnish, who's the gentleman I'm going to talk about. And it's basically, for lack of a better term, he curates management science into digestible things. All right. So he has taken stuff from Deming, Drucker, Shine, McGregor, Porter, etc., and sort of put it into this little package. And he calls it, in the distillation of that is what's called a one-page strategic plan, or an OPSP from his parlance.
Okay.
And I started there I think about 7 years ago. So yeah, 2016. So yeah, almost 8 years ago.
Time flies, doesn't it?
Yeah. And what I did was after my research, I sort of narrowed it down to EOS and Scaling Up. And I reached out to a bunch of EOS coaches and reached out to EOS. And then I reached out to Scaling Up, and I reached out to some local coaches here. And I really sort of felt a better connection with the Scaling Up methodology and the people I spoke with. So I reached out to Vern. I just sort of sent him a note, and I really, mostly what I did is he kind of reached out to me. If I really think about it, is I signed up for his newsletter because I wanted to learn more about it. And he just happened to shoot me a note and say, "Hey, how you doing? This is Vern. Just wanted to see how, what you're doing, what your experience has been." I thought it was like a marketing, an automated message. But you read those and you can usually tell, if you get enough email, you can tell what a human being wrote versus a non-human being. But with AI, it's getting tougher. But at that time, I didn't have that. So I'm like, oh, this is actually a person. So I wrote back and said, hey, I'm thinking about this coaching thing. I really like what you're doing. And I knew nothing about how that was put together. And I said, any recommendations or whatever? And he said, oh, we have a coaching organization. Well, let me send you over to Keith. And Keith was running the group at the time.
Okay.
And I met with Keith, and then about a month and a half, 2 months later, I was in Arizona doing training, getting certified on this, or the started certification process on this methodology. Um, so, and that's really, I've met so many wonderful people from that. And so that was really sort of the first um, trigger of what I'm doing now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a big learner, and I don't do it as much now, but I did a lot of writing to learn. And I
Okay.
would read books and I would write articles, and really more for myself, but I put it out on just on my own blog posts, and and I have I don't know, like 1,000 people or something that are on my newsletter list, give or take. And I wrote this piece. I read this book called American Icon,
Okay.
which is about Alan Mulally. Do you know who Alan
I
Mulally is?
don't. I don't.
Most people don't know who he is. So I
No.
had been speaking about Alan Mulally for years before, and knew about him. And I think he's the finest CEO, at least America has ever had, maybe worldwide.
Wow.
Um, but most people don't know who he is because he's a very humble person, right? He doesn't sort of seek the spotlight. He's not out there in magazines and whatever. He's had his share of things, but it's been in a much smaller way. And the reason that I think he is that, and I've read a lot about leaders, and lots of books on them, and books by them, etc. And no one touches what he did. So in the middle of 9/11, just before that, he took over Boeing commercial aircraft,
Okay.
and he had them coming out of 9/11 better than they went in. Turned them around over, like, I don't know, it's 8 or 9 or 10 years. And he was at Boeing for 20 something years. He started as just he's an aerospace engineer. So he's a pretty sharp guy. Um, and then Bill Ford tapped him and said, hey, can you do the same thing for me? We're in a lot of trouble here. So Ford was in a lot of trouble in the early 2000s. And the year he took over, the year Alan took over, they lost $17 billion that year.
Wow.
And he was there from 2006 to 2014. And he did the same thing there, and he turned them around, where it wasn't the year he was there, but the next year, 2015, Ford was the #1 car company in the world for that year,
Wow.
and
Wow.
hadn't been #1 since Henry Ford.
Uh-huh.
And what was really cool about it is, I don't know if you remember, but Ford jettisoned a lot of its brands. It had Jaguar and Volvo and these other things, and he said, look, we got to get back to the basics. We got to get back to who we are. And he got rid of a lot of potential revenue, if you will, and still grew the company to the size that it was. So I read this book, and it really connected to what I do. And what he did at Boeing and Ford was very familiar to me. He called it something else, and I'm sure he had his own way of doing it. But I sort of tied it to that, and I wrote an article about it. And it is my most read article. Is 10, 12,000 people have read this article.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
over the few years that I've had it. And about almost 3 years ago, yeah, a little over 3 years ago, he read it. Because it was out there, and if you type in Alan Mulally and Bill Flynn into Google, that article will probably be the first thing.
Okay. Okay.
Or it was. I don't know if it is anymore. So we had a conversation. He reached out to me and said, hello, Bill, I read this article and I want to meet you. And, I talked to him that day, and we had this great conversation. He said, love to be able to help you. What can I do to help you? And I said, I'm not, I said, this is a once in a lifetime offer. So Alan Mulally he's been asked by 2 presidents to be on their cabinet. He was in the middle of the COVID crisis. He was asked by the Mayo Clinic to come in and help them with their logistics and all this other stuff. So he's a pretty
kind of a big deal.
kind of a big deal,
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was kind of shocking. I'm like, I'm talking to Alan Mulally. That's just crazy.
Right.
Um,
Right. How
so
awesome
about
is
a
that?
few weeks later, I got back to him and said, there were 3 things that I said, you don't have to do any of this, but I thought about it, and this would be great. And one of them was, I said, it seems like you're part of this organization that has some really cool people in it that I could learn a lot from. And if there's any way I could be part of that, that would be kind of neat. And three weeks later, I was in the group. And so this is a group run by Marshall Goldsmith, who's the #1 executive coach in the world. Um, Started doing it 40 years ago, and people in the business world who've written books, like Ken Blanchard, the 1 Minute Managers in the group, Dory Clark, who's written a bunch of books on entrepreneurship, Michael Bungay Stanier, who's written Coaching Habit, and a bunch of athletes, professional athletes, and all these people whose stuff I know and read, and I get to hang out with them like once a year, live, and just chat with them.
Yeah.
So it's just a cool thing to be in. So that's definitely changed. Those two things really are the two relationships I think, at least, in the last 10 or 15 years, that really are memorable to me.
Wow. What an amazing story. And Bill, I mean, so you write this article and just put it out there, and then Alan ends up seeing it and then was just moved enough by it that he's like, I'm going to reach out to this guy, Bill. I just want to get to know him and stuff.
Yeah.
And what a powerful testament right there to the power of relationships.
Yeah. And humility. I think it's also
you're right.
humility.
You're right.
Holy cow.
And I don't want to turn this around and talk about me. I want to keep the focus on you and what you're sharing here. But I have experienced stuff like this too, where just being ourselves and just being, so what I have definitely discovered over the years, that it does not matter how successful somebody is, how big of a business they run. It doesn't matter who the heck they are. There is not a person on the face of this earth that gets too much appreciation. And when we just show genuine appreciation with no agenda, not trying to do it to get anything, but just genuinely are appreciative of people and let them know that. I mean, I've been doing that intentionally for 11 years now. And I cannot tell you how many conversations that's spurred on, how many doors that's opened. I mean, it's absolutely, and this, you just shared such a perfect example of that, And so if you look back, Bill, at these two, and it's interesting, Vern Harnish, I know you and I were talking before we hit the record button about Joe Polish and about Dan Sullivan. And Joe Polish runs this group that he started in 2007 called Genius Network. Vern is in that group, and I've been in that group. And so I got to meet Vern as a result of
cool. All right, great.
Stuff. So small world. And so, if you look back over the years on these two relationships with Vern and Alan, and I'm sure you're going to be able to come up with lots of examples of the question that I'll ask you. But I'm just going to challenge you. Just the first example that comes to your mind, I would love to hear about that. So if you look back at these two relationships with Vern and Alan, and you look at an instance where you were able to make a really valuable impact, a really big impact, and you also know, hands down, that would have never happened if not for your relationship with either Vern or with Alan. What is an example of something like that, Bill?
Yeah, well, about 3 or 4 years ago, I met a woman, and we just sort of clicked and got along really well. She was just getting into, trying to figure out what to do with her life, and I don't know how we got connected. It was somewhere on LinkedIn or something. And I introduced her to this another coaching organization that I was in called Metronome. And I said, this is something that I do. I really love it. I explained it to her, and she's like, "Oh, that sounds great." And I introduced her to the people who ran it, and then she got into the group, loved it, really enjoyed it, became part of another coaching team near her, because I don't know how much you know about this, but any situation where you're a solopreneur, especially when you're doing the kind of things that we do, which it's difficult to find the right kind of mindset to have them be someone who you can work with. And generally, when I find them, I work with them for years.
Okay.
So that's great. So I don't need to find too many, but it's still difficult to do. Um, and getting your business started and going, they say it takes 3 to 5 years to get any business started. So there's always that, and COVID was an impact,
You
etc. So
bet.
she struggled a little bit, and then we talked about what she wanted to do, and we just talked a little bit more. And I said, maybe you want to try something else that isn't this. It's a simpler thing than what we're doing now with sort of scaling up with this metronome thing on top of it. Um, and we talked through that. I introduced her to a couple of people that I knew that were part of the group. It was EOS, and now she's an EOS coach. And my understanding is she's doing better, right? She's done better than she was before, and
That's awesome.
so
That's
it's just kind of it's kind of nice to be able to I didn't tell her what to do. I just sort of walked through it, and it's sort of like what you were talking about. This that I can't remember the person's name you mentioned. Someone that helped you find your genius. Um,
Oh, Dan Sullivan.
it was Dan. Okay, it was
Yeah, it
Dan.
was Dan. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of that's kind of what I helped her do, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And find out what works for her. So that was, I haven't talked to her in a little while, but that's definitely a relationship that I'm happy that I was able to be a part of, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, and then you look at somebody like that who's now coaching for EOS, and I can only imagine that the people that she has now helped over that time period, and because of who they are and the impact that their businesses have in the world, the real impact of that, I don't know that you'll ever really know, but it's very substantial. And that's
Yeah,
the
exactly.
thing that happens is, because of who we serve, and we serve these entrepreneurs who are going out there and they are making a big impact, direct line, front line with who they serve. But those people in turn are also making such a profound impact in the world through their businesses, with their team, with their vendors, with the clients that they serve. And I mean, and the ripple effect of this, we'll never truly know. And we end
Yeah.
up getting people reaching out to us that are like, that end up sharing stories that, like, you're like, wow, you find out years later that this is tied to this, like, I would have never even saw that if you hadn't shared, kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's
And
funny. One of the former heads of the 100 coaches group that I'm in, that I told you about, with Al Mullally and other folks. This is probably the third gathering. We did a virtual gathering, and then we did two in-face gatherings in the last 3 years. And she came up to me and just said, "I just want you to know, you're in my head all the time." She had her own business, and talking about the things that I talked about, and she had read my book. I was like, "Really?" And I don't really know her that well. And we had dinner once, and I hung out at her apartment in New York and chatted with her a little bit. But it was sort of a brief encounter, and
yeah,
I was like, wow, that's just such a wonderful thing to hear, right? Is that that something you said or wrote down or whatever was helpful to someone else. I mean, that's
yeah,
just really cool.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, Bill, for anybody listening to this going, man, Kev, I really like Bill. I like what he stands for. I like the way he shows up. If they'd like to find more information on you, is there any resources or websites they can check out?
Yeah, so my website is catalystgrowthadvisors.com.
Okay. Okay.
And everything is on there. All the articles I've written are up there. It's like 150, 160 of them over the last few years. My book is up there. You can download my book for free as a PDF, or you can get it from Amazon or Audible if you want. It's called Further Faster. The Vital Few Steps That Take the Guesswork Out of Growth is the subtitle. And some of the stuff I do, my contact info, all that, everything is right there. www.catalystgrowthadvisors.com.
Perfect. Perfect. And I'll make sure we include that with the show notes and stuff. Bill, any last thing you feel led to share before we call it a wrap on this?
So who is your audience, Kevin? Like, how would
So
you describe
my
it?
audience is established entrepreneurs, founders and CEOs is who my audience is for this.
Okay, great. So, and we talked a little bit about this. So I did 10 startups for 25 years, helped them make hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars over that time. Now I do coaching, etc. And the one thing that I've learned from sort of scale up, startup to scale up, is that they're two different things, right? A startup, there's a great definition by Steve Blank. A startup is a temporary organization in search of a business model, right? And you definitely need to focus on that. Once you've found your business model and you want to scale, some just want to have a lifestyle business, then it's a completely different model, right? And you have to sort of revisit all the key and critical decisions that you made prior to, and make sure that your next journey forward is really focused on three things that I've learned. One is that make sure you have the right team and team of teams, right? The team that got you there isn't necessarily the team that's going to get you to the next level. And that's okay, right? That's just the way it goes. You should look at your business as one system, which is made up of subsystems and components, right? And you have to make sure you understand those systems. And a lot of this is in the scaling up stuff that I've learned. And the last thing is, if you really want to grow your business in a healthy way, your primary financial metric should be cash, because you need cash to grow your business. You generally need it before growth. So you need to make sure you understand how you're going to generate cash, and make sure you understand how much cash you actually need, and then go back and create, okay, what do we need to do in order to make that money so we can build the thing that we want to build in the long term? So team, sort of business as an operating system, and cash are the three things that I've learned from scaling up versus startup, which is really just in search of a business model.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Bill, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I'm really excited to get this out there and share it with a lot of other entrepreneurs. One of the right from the get-go in launching this podcast, the goal was twofold. I wanted to give entrepreneurs like yourself the opportunity to, talk about and honor the most valuable relationships that you've had in your life and in your business. And then for the listeners who, like I mentioned, are also entrepreneurs, founders, and CEOs, I just wanted to use these conversations to inspire them to place an even more intentional focus on creating more real, meaningful, rewarding, and profitable relationships in their own lives. And Bill, we definitely delivered on that today, thanks to you. So I really appreciate you. And thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Kevin.